afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Parker Bullen webinar on alternatives to redundancy. Hope you're well today, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy, as I say, half-term week to join us. It is great to see you all here today. My name is Andrew Marshall. I will be your host for this short webinar today. My job here is strictly a functionary. I'm here to push the right buttons, ask any questions, and generally keep things on the straight and narrow. If this is the first one of these webinars that you've been to, this is an informal, chatty style affair, so please do get involved. And the best way to do so is to use the questions button at the bottom of the screen. Type in any questions you have, and we'll try to cover as many as possible, either during or at the end of the presentation. Before I hand over to today's presenters, just a couple of items of housekeeping. We're aiming for a 20-minute runtime today, but with questions that may run up to about 30 minutes or so. We are recording the webinar today, so the link will be shared with you afterwards. And we've also prepared a summary handout of the main talking points that likewise we'll be sending to you. So the purpose of the webinar today is to share with you some useful information, practical tips, and some guidance on the topic of alternatives to redundancy. Just as a general disclaimer, any advice we give is generic and should not be relied upon unless you have spoken to us separately, and we provide you with advice that's pertinent to your individual circumstances. So in today's webinar, we'll be talking about the alternatives to redundancy and the practical considerations behind them. And to present the topic, may I hand over to today's presenters. We have with us Molly Dilling, who is a trainee solicitor in our employment department, and Alana Penkethman, who is a chartered legal executive in the same team. So without further ado, over to you, Molly and Alana.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So thank you, everyone, for taking the time out to come and watch our webinar today. So really, the purpose of this webinar is in light of the fact that the furlough scheme is coming to an end on Halloween, so this weekend. And unfortunately, we are beginning to see tougher coronavirus restrictions coming back into play once again. And as a result of this, employers will be having to make difficult decisions about their employees' futures. So as I said, the purpose of this webinar today is to demonstrate to both employers and employees that redundancy isn't the only option. So we understand businesses are struggling, but ultimately we want to show you that there are many alternatives to redundancy, and we would really strongly advise that you would consider them. So just a question for the audience, really. Wouldn't it be great to not only retain your employees throughout the pandemic, but to actually emerge with a more united and stronger workforce? So I just want everyone to keep that in their minds whilst we're talking through this today.
Okay, so as Molly said, this is quite a pivotal time in employment law, and that's why we were so keen to do this now. As Molly said, the coronavirus job retention scheme ends this week, and a lot of businesses have relied on this scheme quite heavily. At the same time, we've got these tougher lockdown restrictions, again, which are limiting employers and businesses as to how they can work, and sort of penalties, I suppose. And we want to really try and see as many employers as possible retain their workforce. Ultimately, that's going to be better for businesses throughout. We're going to be looking at who will pay those who don't have enough work to support their salary, so where it's just a drop in work, basically. And who's going to pay those who can't work from home but can't trade right now, so those jobs that are usually done that need to be done in a workplace but can't be done in that workplace. And who will be paying those who are currently shielding or caring for those who are shielding and simply can't integrate with the rest of the workforce at the moment.
So I think it's really important, before we discuss the alternatives to redundancy, you probably want to know why at the moment we would advise against going straight to redundancy. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the problems. The main issue is that it's permanent. It can't be revoked, and ultimately you are ending someone's employment. It's a very strong step, and it makes things a bit difficult later down the line. Procedurally, redundancy is really expensive, especially if you're making a large amount of employees redundant. The procedural fairness of redundancy is a whole other webinar really, but ultimately you do need to follow the proper consultation process, and this can be expensive, and actually you're going to have to pay these employees during that consultancy period, and afterwards you're going to have to pay them a statutory redundancy payment, which if they've worked for you for quite a long time, it could be quite a significant amount. Long term, it's really expensive. I mean, it is a really uncertain time for businesses, but ultimately we don't know what's going to happen in 6 months. Potentially, you might be having a rough time at the moment, but your business could increase its profits significantly, and if you've made all your staff redundant, you are going to have to rehire people, which costs money in itself, the recruitment process, but also, you know, retraining as well. And chances are that you're not going to have the quality of staff that you may have done before you made the redundancy. So that is quite a significant risk to take, which goes on to the point that it is risky. There's very strict guidance as to how a redundancy process should be followed, both, you know, procedurally wise. You need to make sure that it's fair, you're choosing the people, you know, fairly, you're not discriminating against anyone, and ultimately there is a really, well, potentially significant chance that if someone does think it's unfair, they can bring an employment tribunal claim, which could incur the employer a lot of fees, and also a lot of time with that. And actually, on a day-to-day basis, making redundancy is really bad for your remaining workforce's morale. You've got the remaining workforce are going to have a higher workload, and actually they're going to be working with that constant fear that they might be made redundant, and that's not a nice position for employees to be in.
Definitely, and there's obviously lots of reasons why you should be looking at alternatives anyway. So the obvious one is to save some cash. We've just said about how expensive redundancy is. If you can avoid it, you can save some money. And we've also gone through the legal requirement that has to be a fair consultation, and part of that consultation process is to look at the alternatives to make sure it can't be avoided. But the other reasons are that you get better employment, better employee engagement and long-term loyalty. All of this is going to sound a bit fluffy and cheesy, but the reality is that employees want to feel valued, and if you can have meaningful consultation with them, listen to what they're saying and explore alternatives and show them that you're basically doing everything you can to retain their employment, that's valued, and employees will, you know, will take that and turn it into, you know, loyalty, and they won't be tempted to look elsewhere later on. And you actually end up with the potential for sort of a united feeling that we saw right at the start of lockdown, where you've got everybody in it together, looking at ways to keep business going, and you ultimately, you know, build a better, stronger business as a result of it.
So moving on to the alternatives. So the first one we're going to talk about is the job support scheme. So I'm sure most people would have heard of this. So this is a replacement for the furlough scheme, which comes into practice on the 1st of November. So this is slightly different to the furlough scheme in that the employees, to be eligible, you must work at least 20% of your normal hours. To be honest, it's quite a complex scheme, but I'm hopefully going to try and simplify it using our lovely Alana as the example. So imagine Alana is contracted to make it simple 5 days per week. So to be eligible for this scheme, Alana must work at least 20% of her normal hours. So in a 5-day week, that would be 1 day per week. You've then got 80% of the working week that's not worked by the employee. So for that, out of that 80%, the government will contribute, it's just under 62% of the employee's wages for that remainder of those hours, and that's capped at a value of £1,541.75 per month. You've then got the obligation on the employer, who has to pay 5% of those remaining hours which aren't worked. So as I say, if Alana's working 1 day, the employer will have to pay 5% of the wages for the 4 days that she doesn't work. So that's a total of 67% that the employee will be paid. So it is complex, and it does unfortunately keep changing. It's only changed again in the past few days. There is the additional cost of it at the outset. I guess the key thing is that not all businesses will either be able to afford or have the work for people to be able to work 20% of their hours. But we would really encourage you to take it if you can, because we've talked about the fact that you want to retain your staff and avoid the costs of the rehiring later on down the line. And also, if you do retain your staff, there is still the government bonus of £1,000 if you keep these employees on until January. And to bear in mind that the scheme lasts for 6 months. So as I said, you will save the cost of the redundancy process and rehiring and retraining. So it's a really good scheme, and it's actually quite flexible in a way, because you might, as I said, you might not have 20% of the hours now, you might be scraping it, but who knows, in 4 months' time you can slowly work employees back up to working their full 100% hours. So it's really good if you are able to retain those employees.
It's incentive for the employee too, because the more they work, the more pay they get. So for the hours they do work, they get 100% of their wages for that time. The only part that's subsidised is the part that they don't work. And on that part that they don't work, they're actually only losing 33% of their salary. And so they're ultimately walking away with a minimum of 77% of their salary, however much their hours are cut, as long as you don't go below that 20% threshold. So it does just about work. And as Molly said, they are constantly changing it. But I think there was also a lot of flaws with the initial draft last week. And this version, it's more complex, but it asks less of the employer and it provides more for the employee. So ultimately, I think we're getting closer to a better system.
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is more favourable to the employer than the furlough scheme,
That's
because
it.
especially the furlough scheme in the past few months, I think at the moment, even though the employee's not working, the employer is still required to top up their wages by 20%. So for the employer, if they're only having to pay 5% plus the 20% for the hours actually worked, that is more beneficial for the employer. So although on the face of it, it sounds less positive than the furlough scheme, it is actually more beneficial.
Absolutely. But obviously that one is complex, so do give us a call about the individual circumstances on it, because it will massively depend on what hours are worked. So then we move on to redeployment and retraining. This idea works really well where one part of your business is coping better with the pandemic than another. And we've seen this work amazingly in a local firm who we've been really impressed by. BP Rolls up on one of the estates near the office. They've managed to adapt their workforce, and where they found that business reduced when they were servicing vehicles, and footfall was reduced in and out of the business, they saw that the workload to service those sort of food delivery and home delivery vehicles went through the roof, or the need to provide that service. So they were able to actually move their workforce from the sort of normal servicing area over to the home delivery area. And that way they were able to keep the workforce and meet the demand on the additional side of the business. And so they were able to transfer those skills in a really effective way. And actually they've managed to thrive during the pandemic, which is great. So we were really pleased to see a local business, say BP Rolls, do that so well. And that's something that you really should be exploring, because it's had such an impact on businesses that different areas are thriving and other areas are sort of suffering. So if you can have that option, do explore it. And it can be temporary or permanent, depending on how the business develops, because you may find that actually moving your workforce and focusing on one area can actually be a real long-term improvement to the business, which you might not have explored before. So just keep your workforce flexible, offer the chance to retrain and during a difficult time. And again, that's a positive step that you can be giving to your employees when everything else sounds so negative.
Yeah. Definitely. So another option, alternative, is to make temporary variations to an employee's work. So there's various options where you can do this, either reducing people's hours or reducing the head count. But we wanted to just talk about a few ways in which this can be done. So talk about reducing working hours and encouraging flexible working. Alana and I are both really big advocates of flexible working, because we think it is really beneficial to workforces, but actually in a situation it can be a really good tool. Some people might decide that they don't want to do their full-time hours anymore for various reasons. So this is a good opportunity for them to be able to come to the employer and say, actually, I want to reduce my hours, which in turn saves the employer money. But also flexible working is really, really great, because the reach to your clients can be increased. Because if people, I mean, especially in businesses like ours, you know, our clients aren't always available during office hours. So if we can do flexible working to work before work or after work, that increases our scope. The other thing is, you know, we've learned in the pandemic that not everyone has to work from the office. And although this might not seem like a major cost, if you've got half of your office working from home, then that saves the overheads, you know, in the office environment, which is really good. Also, you know, there is the concept of layoffs and pay cuts. This isn't necessarily attractive to employees, but I think that one thing we would say is that it's a really difficult time for anyone. It's really difficult to get a job, and as possibly blunt as this sounds, people would rather take those temporary cuts now and still have a job in 6 months' time. Yeah, that probably sounds a bit harsh, but people are willing to accept things like that at the moment. And people that have got long service, you know, they want to save the business, and if that's the way that they can save the business, they'll take it. The other thing, appreciate we're going quite, and we've not got a lot of time, but if we talk about sabbaticals as well, you know, people might want to take career breaks. You never know what's going on in your employer's life, and I think a really important point is that you shouldn't choose these people. You should ask them to volunteer, because you really don't want to open yourself up to discrimination claims by, for example, not that anyone would ever do this, but saying, okay, well, this person's near to retirement, so I'll suggest that they reduce their hours. You know, get an open, you know, have a consultation. Communication is really important. I said, yes, it's really important that you ask volunteers rather than approach individual people.
Yeah, that's it. And I think one thing that's a really good option when you're trying to present it as a positive way, because as Molly said, obviously it's a pretty bleak proposal, but at the end of the day, we're looking at alternatives to redundancies here. It's not going to be, you know, something that's lots of fun. But one of the incentives for the career break is that the government are doing this brilliant training scheme at the moment, where there's a number of really great recognised qualifications which are available for free. A lot of them can be done online, and it's a great opportunity to actually, you know, improve your skill set. Oh, sorry. So the last one, it's kind of an obvious one, I suppose, is it's basically looking at reductions elsewhere and looking at your priorities. At the end of the day, these are your people, and they are your greatest asset. Again, I know it sounds cheesy, but at the end of the day, it's your people that are going to keep your business going. So where else can you save? There's number of grants available in the Test Valley here. We've got a number of rent relief grants and small business grants that the council are offering, and that they're all available online, and you could save money that way. And there may be a short-term solution. You know, is there a department that you can perhaps reduce rather than reducing a whole role? Could you, rather than reduce and remove that department, could you reduce its scope and its need, and again move it into another department which is growing, which is a short-term solution rather than redundancy, which is permanent? And redundancy might seem like the obvious answer, but because it's so expensive, it really is better to try and make savings elsewhere.
So it's an ongoing theme of employment law. Communication is essential. Any changes you make need to be communicated to your employees, and you need to consult with them. So you should, as we said, take suggestions from your employees, and not because you have to. You know, you might actually find that your employees care about your business a lot more than you maybe think they do. So, and they want to keep their jobs, and they want to see the business thriving. So, you know, they might be open to these discussions. As we said, it's essential that you don't single people out. Please ask for volunteers. There might be people unexpected that want to take a career break. You never know. It's really important to avoid, you know, to do that, to avoid any discrimination claims, and don't apply blanket policy. So don't say that everyone has to work flexibly or everyone has to take a career break, because that just opens yourself up to discrimination claims, which you really want to avoid. Okay, so we're just going to talk.
Yeah, we're just going to basically repeat really again to try and drill home why you should be looking at these alternatives. And as we said, it's to save some cash, and the fact that it's a legal requirement, and that long term it can really pay off if you can build a better, stronger workforce and a better, stronger business where everybody feels valued and you work better internally. So I've got a couple of easy wins, which you start by looking at your finances. It seems obvious, but just look at it in detail and consult your accountant, or engage an accountant, and look at your books properly rather than just simply reducing your headcount. Look at your business structure and is there room for movement, look at where the business is succeeding and where it's struggling, and then again look at your funding. There are 3 easy options that don't involve a redundancy. Finances, business structure and funding could make a difference and save someone's salary.
So we're just going to talk through a few top tips that we have. Speak with your employees early and invite their comments. You don't want to be making rush decisions because, as we said, redundancy is really permanent, so you really want to avoid that if possible. And invite their comments as well. If you make any changes, although if we're talking about temporary variations, you don't need to amend someone's employment contract, we would strongly recommend that you document any conversations you have with your employees, such as if someone's agreeing to take a career break. That's really essential that you do that, and that there's a mutual understanding of what that temporary variation involves. And if you are going to make permanent variations, so if you've kind of got to the point where you said, okay, well, we just can't afford to keep someone on full-time hours, but we want to keep them on and we're going to change them to part-time hours, you need to record that variation in the employee's contract and make sure that you get express consent. Don't just do that unilaterally, because that, again, opens a whole can of worms to a potential employment claim.
Okay, I think that's us. Hopefully we may have saved somebody's salary.
We're happy to take any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you very much indeed, Molly and Alana. Some genuinely excellent and very useful stuff there. We did have a few questions come through the last 10 or so minutes. I've got one here from Steve. Steve asks, can I use the JSS if my business has been forced to close?
I'll take that one because I say it's fairly complex scheme, but they have divided it into the JSS open and the JSS closed. And the open one is the one that we discussed earlier, and that would apply to most businesses. The closed scheme is available to those businesses which are in tier 3 and they are legally required to close. So Molly and I have talked about hospitality and theatre and events and even theme parks. Those that are in tier 3 will have had to close and they won't be able to work at all or pay their employees anything. And so in that situation, the government have actually stepped up that contribution to the full 67%, even though the employee isn't doing any work, but that is strictly for tier 3 only.
Okay, hope that answers your question, Steve. One from Helen. Helen says, you suggested that flexible working can be a means to save costs. Can you explain this?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, we said so flexible working has many benefits, not only in the pandemic, but just in general. It's really about having that trust in your employees. And if you can afford to let them go down to part-time, that can be really good for your your headcount and your finances wise, but also good for them and better for their employee well-being. But also, as we talked about, the office headcount as well, that's really important, because I know a lot of people, actually myself included, don't feel entirely comfortable being in the office all the time. So if you can let people work from home and you trust people to work from home on a flexible basis, that's really, really positive for both. Well, 2 reasons really. First of all, you're having half the amount of computers in the office being used, which saves a lot of electric, and arguably half the amount of cups of coffee being made as well, which probably helps. But also, we talk about the importance of employee well-being as well, and if they are able to work from home and they feel safer, that's brilliant. But also, the office is much more COVID secure, and it's easier to keep it COVID secure if there's less people in there, and you're also protecting yourself from any claims there as well. So there's a number of reasons really how it works. And also another thing is job shares as well. So ultimately it's cheaper to have 2 people sharing one job than it is to have 2 people doing 2 separate jobs. So that is another option that you can use.
And I think also for those people that are shielding, we've touched on discrimination a few times, but if you are either shielding or living with someone who's shielding, then making a reasonable adjustment under disability legislation, under the Equality Act, can be really expensive. If you need that person to be in the workplace because you can't work flexibly, whereas if you're able to allow them to work flexibly and remove themselves from the rest of the workforce, that can be a much cheaper option than actually making a formal reasonable adjustment to try and protect that one employee.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for your question, Helen. And I think we've got time for, conscious of time, we've got time for one more. Gordon asks, if I transfer employees from one part of the business to another, does this need to be permanent?
No, I guess I'll take this one, that it absolutely doesn't need to be permanent. Again, communication is going to be important here, that you're basically explaining the basis for that transfer well to the employee and documenting the understanding. But at the same time, parties, both the employer and the employee, shouldn't be afraid of being open to it being a permanent change if it works. As I say, we are guilty of coming in and doing the jobs we know and we know we can do well. But actually, there's not to say that if an employee is transferred to another department and they excel in that department and it works for employer and employee, then obviously it could be permanent. But you're certainly not creating a contractual right unless you change the contract. So if you're moved over, it is on a temporary basis. You've made it clear it's on a temporary basis and that they'll be returned to their former role as soon as it's required, if it's required.
Brilliant. And again, thank you very much for your question there, Gordon. Having a through, I think, yep, and that brings us neatly to the end. Thank you very much indeed, Molly and Alana, for your for the presentation. That was absolutely fantastic. And thank you everyone out there who's attended today. Just a reminder, the webinar scene has been recorded and we'll send you a link with the email details provided, along with a summary handout just of the main talking points. If you do have any queries about anything we've discussed in today's webinar, or indeed if you would like any tailored advice specific to you on the topics covered, please do get in touch. All of our details are on the screen right there. Other than that, thank you very much and have a good rest of the afternoon, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.